On August 13th, 2,500 workers drove out to one of the most important beef plants in America expecting another shift. By the end of that day, the plant was finished. No transition period, no final production run, no time for the town to get ready. Tyson Foods had just erased the biggest employer in the county, and most of the people who worked there found out the same way you find out a relative died. Somebody handed them a piece of paper. Here is the part that still does not sit right with me. Companies close plants all the time. Usually there is a countdown. 60 days, 90 days, a press release in the spring, and a padlock in the fall. Cattle producers in the Midwest normally get about 2 months of warning before a plant this size goes dark. Joslin got 0. And the reason it got 0 has almost nothing to do with what you would expect, and everything to do with a decision made about American cattle a long way from Illinois. Joslin, Illinois is not really a town. The census counted 85 people there in 2020. It is a name on Route 92, some fairgrounds that hosted the county fair back in the 1890s, and then this enormous low gray building sitting in the middle of farmland with a parking lot big enough for a stadium. That building killed and processed around 3,000 cattle a day. It employed more people than lived in the surrounding villages combined. Buses ran out to it from Davenport across the river in Iowa 3 times a day, every weekday for 40 years. Men and women slept on those buses on the way in and slept on them on the way home. And on a Thursday afternoon in August, all of it stopped inside of about 6 hours. 3 things about this story took me a while to understand, and I am going to walk you through all 3. The first is why Tyson could legally shut it down that fast. The second is what the number 2,500 actually costs a region like this, which is not the number people think it is. And the third is the one that made me want to make this video at all. Tyson is not closing this plant because Americans stopped buying beef. Beef has never been more expensive in this country. The reason is stranger than that, and it starts about 6 years ago, in pastures 1,000 miles away. Let me start with the last day. Workers arriving for their shift on Thursday, August 13th, were told to go to the plant cafeteria. That alone is not unusual. Big plants do all-hands meetings for safety weeks, benefits enrollment, holiday schedules. People filed in the way you file into anything at work, half paying attention, thinking about the 8 hours ahead of them. Then they were handed letters. The letters said the plant was closing. Not closing eventually, closing. Primary job duties ended August 13th and 14th. Harvest operations stopped that same day. A small crew would stay behind to shut the building down properly. One woman who spoke to a local news crew in the Quad Cities, and who would not give her name, described the room afterward. She said people started fighting, people were yelling, people were crying. She mentioned that she knew people in that room who had been working there more than 30 years. Think about what that means practically. 30 years on a kill floor or a fabrication line is a body that has been used up in a particular way. That is a specific skill set and a specific set of injuries, and it does not transfer to an Amazon warehouse or a hospital job or anything else within driving distance. The union representing them, UFCW Local 1546, said it got no advance notice either. Their president, Robert O'Toole, described the closure as like a tornado ripping through the community. He also said something that I keep coming back to. If the union had been told in advance, it would have tried to sit down and work out something to keep the plant running. Instead, the first they heard of it was the same day the cattle stopped moving. Now, there is a detail buried in the paperwork that almost nobody picked up on, and I want to flag it early, because it explains the whole shape of what happened. Workers were told their pay would continue through October 12th. Count the days. August 13th to October 12th is 60 days. 60 days is the notice period the Federal WARN Act generally requires before a mass layoff at a plant this size. Companies are allowed to satisfy it by paying people through the window instead of keeping the doors open through the window. So the workers got their 60 days. They just got them as a wire transfer instead of as a warning. The building was already cold. Hold on to that, because it is going to come back when we talk about the cattle producers who did not get 60 days of anything. To understand what was lost here, you have to go back much further than Tyson. This plant was not built by a corporation. It was built by farmers and small-town businessmen who thought they were being clever. The project was announced on September 27, 1968. 4 men from Geneseo, Illinois put it together with 21 other investors. Their names were Martin Angevine, Robert Cherry, V.J. Lohman, and James Hutchinson. The idea was straightforward and honestly correct. Illinois was one of the top cattle states in the country, and Illinois cattle were being trucked out of state to be killed somewhere else. Why send the value away? Build the plant here, keep the money here. They broke ground on December 29, 1969, in weather cold enough that the fact that 50 civic leaders showed up made the newspaper. A local congressman came out for it. The plant cost $6 million and opened as Illini Beef Packers with about 225 employees. Lohman said at the dedication that he thought it meant something to be opening a plant and hiring people at a moment when other companies in the area were laying off. 225 jobs. That is where this started. The next 15 years are the part of the story that nobody in the Quad Cities talks about anymore, and they are the reason this closure feels so familiar to people who have lived there a long time. In July 1980, the founding group sold the plant to Dubuque Packing Company. Dubuque ran it for about 2 years and then announced it was closing the plant and putting 575 people out of work. That closure did not stick. The governor of Illinois at the time, James Thompson, flew out to Joslin 2 days after the closure announcement to announce that the plant had been sold instead. The buyer was Iowa Beef Processors, IBP, and that is the moment the plant stopped being a local business and became a node in a national machine. IBP is the company that invented modern American meatpacking, and I mean that in both the good and the ugly sense. Before IBP, beef was shipped as carcasses to butchers who broke it down in the back of the shop. IBP moved the cutting into giant plants out by the feedlots, broke the work into small repeatable motions, and shipped vacuum-sealed boxes of finished cuts straight to grocery stores. It was faster and cheaper than anything that came before it. It also meant a skilled trade got replaced by an assembly line, wages fell, and the plants got very big and very concentrated. By the time IBP bought Joslin in 1983, it already had the largest beef slaughter plant in the world, running in Finney County, Kansas. Joslin became its easternmost operation, its foothold in the Corn Belt, and IBP expanded it. The people at Joslin kept their jobs. The sign out front changed. The bus route from Davenport kept running, the same route Metrolink had started back in the mid-1980s when the plant still had IBP's name on it. 3 buses a day, somewhere between 100 and 125 riders, the only route of its kind in the system. That is 55 years of continuous operation from that groundbreaking in the snow to the letters in the cafeteria. 4 owners, 1 building. And I want you to keep the 1982 near miss in your head, because there is a version of this story where somebody buys Joslin the way IBP bought it. We will get to why that is much harder now. Everyone reporting this used the number 2,500. It is the right number and it undersells the damage badly. Start with money. Local reporting years ago put the plant's annual payroll at roughly $63 million. Adjust that upward for the years since, and you are looking at a very large amount of wage income that was landing in Rock Island County and across the river in Scott County, Iowa, every 2 weeks, and is now landing nowhere. That money did not sit in bank accounts. It bought groceries in Port Byron and Geneseo. It paid rent in Moline and Davenport. It paid for tires, haircuts, insurance premiums, youth sports fees, church collections, and about 100 small businesses that never once thought of themselves as being in the beef industry. Now the second layer, which is the one that gets missed. The plant bought cattle. Most of them came from Illinois and Iowa, from feedlots close enough that a truck could make the trip in an hour or 2. Those farms were not employees of Tyson. They were suppliers, and for a lot of them, Joslin was the only realistic buyer within reach. The Illinois Beef Association called it a critical market for family farmers. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association said the plant had played a vital role in the Midwest supply chain for years and asked Tyson to help its longtime customers find somewhere else to sell. Somewhere else, in this case, means between 160 and 400 miles away. The next major beef plant is over 150 miles from Joslin. Here is what that does to a farmer. Freight cost goes up immediately. Cattle lose weight on long hauls, which means you get paid less for the same animal. And the moment your only nearby buyer disappears, whoever is left knows you have nowhere else to go, which means the price they offer you falls. Market analysts in the days after the announcement estimated that bids for cattle in that region could drop by $200 to $300 a head. A feeder near Cambridge, Illinois, about 22 miles from the plant, told an agriculture reporter that a Tyson buyer had come out to look at his cattle that Tuesday, 2 days before the plant closed. He said he had expected a closure eventually. What shocked him was that when Tyson said immediately, they meant that afternoon. So we have workers with no notice and farmers with animals that are ready for market and nowhere to take them. Which brings us to the obvious question. Why would a company do it this way? To answer that, you have to understand what the American beef industry actually is now, because it is not what most people picture. 4 companies buy and process roughly 85% of the fed cattle in the United States. Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef. In 1980, the top 4 packers handled about a third of the market. By the mid-1990s, it was over 80%. It has stayed there ever since. 2 of those 4 are majority owned by Brazilian parent companies. Between them, the 4 own something like 70 meat brands, which is why the shelf at your grocery store looks like a competitive market and is not one. Economists have a specific word for this shape. Not monopoly, oligopsony, a market with many sellers and very few buyers. In a monopoly, the danger is that the seller charges you too much. In an oligopsony, the danger is that the buyers, who are few and enormous, decide what the sellers get paid. The federal government has been circling this for years. The Justice Department has an open antitrust investigation into the 4 packers, looking at whether consumer prices were inflated and whether payments to ranchers were pushed down. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche pointed at plant closures around the country as one of the signals that made the department suspicious. A federal court also allowed a price-fixing class action from cattle sellers to move forward, where the plaintiff's expert argued cattle prices had been suppressed by nearly 7% over a 5-year period. None of that has been proven in a courtroom yet, and Tyson denies wrongdoing. But you do not need a verdict to see the structural problem. When 4 buyers control the market and one of them removes a plant, the cattle in that region do not get a replacement buyer. They get a longer drive and a worse price. So that is the structure. Now the trigger. Because Tyson did not close Joslin out of strength. Tyson closed Joslin because its beef business is bleeding money on a scale that is genuinely hard to picture. Here is the thing that surprised me most while researching this. Beef prices in America are at record highs. Ground beef hit $6.69 a pound in December of 2025, the highest ever recorded. If you have bought a steak recently, you know exactly what I am talking about. And the beef packers are losing money anyway. That combination sounds impossible until you look at the herd. On January 1st, 2026, the USDA counted 86.2 million cattle and calves in the United States. That is the smallest national herd since 1951. The beef cow herd came in at 27.6 million, the fewest since 1960, and the 7th straight year of decline. The calf crop keeps setting new lows. Why? Drought mostly, stacked year after year across the plains. When pastures burn up, feed costs go up, and a rancher facing a bad year has one asset that can be turned into cash immediately. The cows. So they sell breeding stock. That solves this year and guarantees a smaller herd in 3 years. because those animals were the factory. Do that for most of a decade and you end up here. Then a few other things landed on top. The United States closed its border to Mexican feeder cattle over the New World screwworm, cutting off a supply line that had been filling part of the gap. Trade fights raised the cost of imported beef trimmings. Ranchers who might have rebuilt the herd looked at the price of everything from diesel to fertilizer and decided not to. The median American farmer is 58 years old. Between 2017 and 2022, the country lost about 17% of its cattle operations, going from roughly 883,000 down to 732,000. Now put yourself in the packer's chair. Your plant was built to run at a certain volume. That is the entire business model. Enormous fixed costs, thin margin on each animal, profit comes from throughput. When there are not enough cattle, you do not just run slower. You start competing with the other three giants for the animals that exist, and you bid the price of live cattle up past what you can recover selling the meat. Estimated packer margins have been running near negative $200 a head, with some weeks far worse. Tyson's beef segment lost $319 million in a single quarter. For the full 2026 fiscal year, the company guided to an operating loss between $500 and $650 million in beef. For comparison, that same segment made $3.24 billion in profit in fiscal 2021. That is the swing. From the best business in the company to the one dragging everything else down, in 5 years, and chicken is the only reason the overall numbers still look fine. Analysts at Stephens estimated that closing Joslin and Eagle Mountain and selling Pasco saves Tyson somewhere between $100 and $150 million a year. So the decision, on a spreadsheet, is not complicated at all. Which brings me back to the question I opened with. Not why Tyson closed it. Why Tyson closed it that way. Joslin was not the first. In January, Tyson shut its beef plant in Lexington, Nebraska, taking about 5,000 head a day of capacity out of the market and costing roughly 3,200 jobs. It pulled the second shift at Amarillo, Texas at the same time. Now Joslin goes, plus a case-ready facility in Eagle Mountain, Utah, and Pasco, Washington is up for sale rather than closure. Added up, and Tyson removed something like 10,000 head a day of daily capacity in 8 months. Tyson's plan is to anchor its beef business on 3 plants: Dakota City, Nebraska, Holcomb, Kansas, Amarillo, Texas. The company says it can keep harvesting about the same number of cattle across a smaller and more modern network, and that the second shift at Amarillo comes back as cattle become available. But Lexington got months of notice. Joslin got hours. The explanation offered by the Illinois Beef Association is the most revealing sentence in this entire story. Tyson officials indicated they could close immediately because they did not hold cattle contracts in Illinois. Read that again. Where a packer has signed forward contracts with feeders, it has obligations, and those obligations force a wind-down period. Where it does not, there is nothing to unwind. The cattle in the Joslin supply shed were largely bought on the cash market, week to week, handshake to handshake, the old way. The oldest and most independent way of selling cattle in America turned out to be the one that could be canceled without a phone call. And the workers? They were covered by pay through October 12th, which handles the legal notice requirement. 60 days of money, 0 days of warning. Nothing about this was illegal, as far as anyone has alleged. That is sort of the point. The system worked exactly the way it was designed to work, and the people it landed on had no seat at the table where it was designed. So what happens to 2,500 people in a region of maybe 400,000? The paychecks stop October 12th, and the health insurance stops with the job, which is the part that terrifies people with a diabetic kid or a spouse mid-treatment. Tyson has said displaced workers can apply for openings at other company facilities, which is a real offer, and also means moving to Nebraska or Kansas, which for most families is not an offer at all. A state senator, Lee Arellano Jr., called a town hall for August 31st in Port Byron so people could show up and ask questions in a room. A Congressman, Eric Sorensen, called the day devastating for 2,500 skilled union workers at a moment when families are already struggling with prices. Both of those responses are sincere. Neither of them is a plant. The tax base is the slower problem. School districts, the county, the fire and ambulance service near an industrial site like that, all of it was priced around a facility that is now a liability someone has to insure and mow. And here is the thing about the buildings. In 1982, when Dubuque Packing tried to close this same plant, IBP bought it within days because IBP was expanding, cattle were plentiful, and a plant in Illinois was worth having. None of those conditions exist now. The cattle are not there. The industry is contracting. Tyson's competitors are dealing with the same math. Pasco has a real chance of being sold because it is the only major fed cattle plant in the Northwest, and whoever buys it inherits a captive region. Joslin does not have that going for it, which means that this time, the plant probably stays closed. I want to end on the thing that has been sitting in the back of my head since I started reading about this. American beef processing is being pulled into a smaller and smaller number of very large buildings, in a narrow band running from Nebraska down through Kansas into the Texas Panhandle. That is efficient. It is genuinely efficient. Newer plants, better yields, less cost per animal, and in a market with too few cattle, it is arguably the only rational move. The question is, what happens the day one of those buildings has a bad morning? We already have the answer. Twice. In 2019, a fire broke out at a single Tyson beef plant in Holcomb, Kansas. One plant, roughly 6% of national beef capacity, offline for months. In the week after the fire, cattle trading dropped by more than a quarter, and prices moved in ways that ranchers are still angry about and lawyers are still arguing over. In 2021, a ransomware attack hit JBS and shut down plants across the country in a matter of hours. Not a fire, not a flood, software. Every plant that closes makes the remaining ones more essential and the whole system more brittle. There is no spare capacity left sitting around for a bad week, because spare capacity is exactly what the last 5 years of closures were designed to eliminate. So we get cheaper processing and a food supply where 4 companies, and inside those companies a handful of buildings, decide whether the beef moves. The people in that cafeteria on August 13th were not thinking about market structure. They were thinking about a mortgage in Moline, or a kid starting school in 2 weeks, or 30 years of showing up to the same building at the same hour and what that is supposed to add up to. What it added up to was 1 sheet of paper and a bus ride home. The plant was built in 1970 by men who thought their county should keep the value of its own cattle instead of shipping it somewhere else. 56 years later, the value went somewhere else anyway,